Let's be honest. I'll learn Hebrew someday. It's still someday. Yalla, let's start now. The University of San Francisco's Hebrew SF Summer Ulpan program is a live, immersive Hebrew intensive. Just 3 weeks, 3 hours a day. You'll learn to read, write, and speak using conversation, music, film, guest speakers, and culture in a supportive, high-energy learning community. All levels are welcome, even if you're starting from scratch. Learn more at usfca.edu/HebrewSF. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 534. God Bless the Pill. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg.
And I'm Rena Yehuda Newman.
And today we are diving into a new unit of Judaism Unbound on bodily autonomy. We are excited to take a dive into an issue that is super important in contemporary Jewish life. Reproductive justice is one important place to start on that front. And Samira Mehta is our guest today to help us dive into that. We are going to talk with her about a book she wrote that just came out called God Bless the Pill, The Surprising History of Contraception and Sexuality in American Religion. Before we do, a few Judaism Unboundments, and not going to lie, they're pretty substantial this week. First, Shavuot Live is coming up. Our 24-hour extravaganza of Jewish learning and unlearning is just around the corner. It's May 22nd to 23rd. That's Friday into Saturday. Starts at 6 p.m., ends at 6 p.m. because it is 24 hours. Sorry, that's Eastern time. 3 p.m. is the start and end Pacific time. 11 p.m. is the start and end UK time. You don't want to miss it. This is our biggest event of the calendar year. You can sign up by heading to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot 2026. That's SHAVUOT 2026. We are so revved up to have some incredible learning and unlearning over the course of 24 hours where we're climbing up that mountain together and receiving revelation. So that's our first unbouncement. Head to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot 2026 and sign up for an incredible event. Our second is that our certificate program in Unbound Judaism, we have applications opening up. You can apply to become part of our fourth cohort in the certificate program in Unbound Judaism. This has been an incredible and transformative part of our organization's work for the last few years, and we're launching a fourth cohort later this summer. So head to judaismunbound.com/certificate to get all of what you need in order to apply. Again, judaismunbound.com/certificate. So now a little bit more about today's guest, Samira Mehta, who we're going to be talking with about the pill, about the history of contraception in the 20th century and ways in which Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish communities related to contraception. That's the subject of her new book, God Bless the Pill. So a little bit about Samira Mehta. First, in our world, Samira Mehta is a past teacher in the Yeshiva, not once but twice. And she's been on our podcast before in episode 144, talking about a previous book, Beyond Chrismica, the Christian-Jewish interfaith family in the United States. Here's a little bit more about Samira Mehta. Samira K. Mehta is an associate professor of women and gender studies and the director of Jewish studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research and teaching focuses on the intersections of religion, culture, and gender, including the politics of family life and reproduction in the United States. Her first book, Beyond Chrismica, the Christian-Jewish interfaith family in the United States, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. Samira Mehta serves as the primary investigator for the Henry Luce Foundation-funded collaboration Jews of Color, Histories and Futures, and she serves as creative editor at the journal American Religion. She's the co-chair of both the North American Religion section of the American Academy of Religion and the board of E-Feminist Studies in Religion. She holds degrees from Swarthmore College, Harvard University, and Emory University. Samira Mehta, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you on again.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you again.
Well, we're really revved up about this. You and I have been talking about the future world where this book would exist one day for a couple years now, and it has arrived. So, mazel tov.
Imagine how I feel. I've been working on it for a decade.
Yeah, right.
Mazel tov.
So, I want to start by talking about its title. I ask knowing that sometimes authors aren't the last word on what the title is. Sometimes that's the publisher. So I don't know if this was your big call or your publisher's or a combination of both. But God Bless the Pill is the header, the big title, and then The Surprising History of Contraception and Sexuality in American Religion. That's really juicy. I want to start just with God Bless the Pill. That is I don't know if it's provocative or evocative. It's one of the vocatives. Title. What are you getting at with this title, God Bless the Pill? What can we learn by the discomfort or maybe the surprisingness of that phrase? And how might it help us start to dive into the content of your book?
So, the most straightforward answer is that I was casting about for a title. When you are applying for academic jobs, particularly early on in your career, you need to be able to talk about what your next project is going to be. And at first, I was thinking that I might be writing about in vitro fertilization and religion. At the time, there were some amazing books about in vitro fertilization, IVF, in Israel, but there weren't any about religion and IVF in the United States. That's no longer true. There are now books about it. But I have a very close friend and intellectual interlocutor named Anthony Petro, and he said, you will be working on this book throughout your late 30s and early 40s, and maybe beyond. But if there is a stage of your life when you personally will be undergoing IVF, it will be the period of time when you're writing this book. I don't think it's going to be a good idea to set yourself up so that you're stuck having to think in a dispassionate work way about something that you might be having a huge number of personal feelings about. But it was such a thoughtful, he was right? Like that could have happened in my life. It didn't. But I knew about some people working on abortion, and I thought, what about birth control? So I decided I would be working on birth control. Now, there is a song called The Pill, written by a man named Matt McGinn, recorded by Pete Seeger on an album called Dangerous Songs. And it has a line in it about how they're going to bless the pill, and there is the Vatican. It's a song that is written during the Papal Commission on Birth Control, which I write about in my book. And I was like, what if I call it They're Going to Bless the Pill? But A, they didn't. And B, the book isn't just about Catholicism. So back to Anthony Petro. Anthony is really good at coming up with titles. And so I played the song for him and I explained the problem. And he suggested God Bless the Pill. It's the perfect title. A, it comes out of this song, but B, certainly many, many women think God bless the pill. Many people think God bless the pill because they don't want to be pregnant when they don't want to be pregnant. The pill can be used to treat acne, which can be the plague of somebody's adolescence, right? There are lots of reasons why people think God bless the pill, but it's also a title that talks about something that really happened. Really and truly in history, part of the way that birth control in general, and even more particularly the pill, became widely acceptable is because religious leaders, primarily Protestant and Jewish religious leaders, but also some Catholic theologians and Catholic lay leaders and average run-of-the-mill parish priests, decided officially or sort of unofficially and on the down low to offer their blessing, not necessarily in the sense of a bracha, like blessing, a prayer that you would say to sanctify something, but in the sense of their approval for the pill. And so God, in some ways, did bless the pill in the form of the advocacy of religious leaders for accessible, available, respectable contraception.
So that's super interesting. Religious arguments seem to get a lot of victories in your book. I mean, but the victories come with some side effects. I'd love to dive more into this God Bless the Pill title and what it might point to. And I, in particular, would love to start with a figure that your book features toward the beginning and also was part of a class you taught on Yeshiva with us recently. And that's Alan Guttmacher. I'll let you say most of the things about him, but what intrigues me about him is that he is Jewish, and a lot of what he did was through the auspices of Planned Parenthood, which is, of course, not an explicitly Jewish project, although there's many Jews who have been and are part of it. And so it feels like a good window into this conversation. Who was Alan Guttmacher, and why is he a figure that you bring in right at the beginning of your book?
So Alan Guttmacher is a obstetrician and gynecologist. Ultimately, he becomes first the medical director and then the president of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. He's very, very, very active in the PR campaign that makes birth control an acceptable and viable and available form of healthcare. He is involved in New York City. There's a battle to make the diaphragm available in public hospitals. He's a little bit like the Forrest Gump of the birth control movement. He continuously pops up. And that's in the late 1950s, before the birth control pill is approved by the FDA. It's really before the birth control pill is really viable. He writes an article in the 1960s that gets published in a Jewish journal talking about how birth control appears in Torah and Talmud, and how his Orthodox clients, and this is when he's living in Baltimore, have used birth control. He's not living in Baltimore when he writes the article, but the clients that he talks about are. And then in 1970, he's the commencement speaker at Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is one of the Seven Sisters. It's historically a women's college. It remains a women's college now, although with the exception of trans men. And he speaks to those women. It's a decade after the birth control pill has been approved by the FDA. It's 5 years after the Supreme Court has said it is illegal to deny married people access to contraception. It's 2 years before that right is extended to single people. So in 1970, he's the commencement speaker at Smith College, and he says, I come to you as an evangelist, not of religion, but of science. And he says, you have been given the ability to control your fertility. Use that well. And I think it's really significant that he's talking to the women of Smith College. Very white, it's very middle class. It is not yet the bastion of liberal and lesbian politics that it will become. It's getting there, but it's not quite there yet. In a world in which the characters in Scooby-Doo are mapped onto the 5 colleges, of which Smith College is one, it's Daphne. It's not Velma.
Oh my gosh. This is I'm sorry. This is gorgeous, Samira. Okay, for listeners, we need to generate the Shaggies and Scrappies and Scoobies and Daphnes and Velmas.
Oh, Scrappy is not part of the original character.
Oh, I know, but we're an apocryphal people here at Judaism Unbound, so we even embrace those. But we're going to generate all the Jewish Freds and Velmas and Daphnes. Back to you.
Okay, so he's talking to a bunch of women, some of whom are there to become feminist powerhouses, some of whom are they're hoping for much more conventional lives. This is before really the major push of second wave feminism. So he's talking to a group that is predominantly middle class and upper class white women about their need to control their fertility. And I think this is an important piece of the story because people have lots of questions about birth control and eugenics, and those questions are well founded. There are lots of really good historical reasons to have those questions, but it's important to note that Alan Guttmacher, president of Planned Parenthood, is telling well-educated white women destined for the middle and upper classes that they should be using birth control to control their fertility as well. I didn't find, although I also didn't look super hard, for lots of places where he was talking about his Judaism. He writes this article that is published in a magazine called Judaism that talks about Jewish law and birth control and gives a real indication that his Judaism certainly supported his work in birth control, but he's mostly talking as a physician when he's speaking. But Ronit Stahl at the University of California, Berkeley, does really interesting work on why it matters for hospital ethics that so many doctors are Jewish and why it matters for reproductive health care that Jewish doctors are disproportionately represented in obstetrics and gynecology.
One of the things, Samira, that I love about your book is, especially in the introduction, you write really thoughtfully about why in your scholarship, especially as a historian, you're using the term women. And I wanted to ask you explicitly here if you can talk to our listeners. Why do you use the term women when we all know in this podcast that it is certainly not just women and certainly not just cis women who are affected by questions of bodily autonomy, birth control, and contraception?
So, this is a book that really takes place between 1940-ish and 1995-ish. Obviously, there have been trans and non-binary people throughout human history, but a lot of how people think of about identity is shaped by the discourses that they're living in. So, a lot of the conversation that we have today about non-binary identity and trans identity was much less part of broad popular conversation during the time that I was writing. It wasn't necessarily on the radar of the people having these conversations in big public forums. So it's partly just as a historian, I tend to use the terms that people are using in the moment that they're using them, and I tend to talk about the implications of those terms. And in this case, because birth control really gains social traction and social acceptability through its ability to help people more perfectly shape and plan the heteronormative family, it's really important that we're talking about straight women or women who are married to men, both because contraception in this imagined perfect family, but also because it's contraception as much to shape male power and women's economic oppression. They're not imagining that women are going to use the birth control pill to go to law school, to not get knocked up, and therefore not graduate from college. They think that the reason, and the they in this case are not necessarily the women activists, but they are the men power brokers. These sort of male doctors and male clergy and male politicians are imagining that the reason that mothers enter the workforce is because if you can't control how many children you have, you can't guarantee that you can feed them off of your husband's income. But if you can scale the size of your family to the husband's income, then women won't have to go out to work. They'll be more able to hang out and be June Cleaver, which is also an important part of Cold War discourse. There's a lot of rhetoric about how in the Soviet Union, women have to go out to work and their children are warehoused in daycares. But in the United States, capitalism allows women to stay home with their kids. And so the entire discourse is rooted in this understanding.
Which, just to clarify, you're saying in quotes, you're attributing that to other people that are saying that, just for listeners
Yes. Yeah, sorry, I'm talking with my hands. So there is this huge sense, this debate about birth control really gets kind of broad traction and broad respectability in the public eye because it's seen as a tool to create heteronormative patriarchal families. Obviously, birth control conversations, hormone replacement, birth control pills are basically a kind of hormone replacement therapy. They affect so many more people than people who are trying. There are plenty of people who do not identify as cis women who are trying to not get pregnant. B, there are lots of people who are not cis women or necessarily women at all who are using hormone replacement therapy. And there are plenty of cis women who are probably not at high risk for getting pregnant who are really interested in hormone replacement therapy. But what I was really dealing with was this historical conversation. And I thought really hard about it because I think that from an advocacy standpoint, from a current political conversation, it's really important to talk about pregnant people and the needs of pregnant people. I'm a historian, and I think about how these conversations have been shaped by broad historic trends. I think that a lot of the regulation of birth control and abortion are about regulating the bodies of women, of cis women, in support of a normative model that is really bad for lots of people, but is maybe in particular bad for the cis women who get caught up in it And I think that it's massively important to fight for the rights and the access to healthcare and gender affirming care for all people. But I also think that trans men and non-binary people are often collateral damage in the birth control and abortion fights.
So much of what you're saying about the way that historically, so much of the panic or the focus about who should birth control be for, especially when you have Guttmacher coming in and speaking with white middle class, broadly speaking, especially in historical terms, cis women who are in the room of Smith College. So much actually of the panic of transphobia as it affects specifically transmasculine people is actually about this too. There is this really
Yes,
important and horrible book called Irreversible Damage. And it's really the original tirade against transmasculinity. The basic premise of it and the cover image of this book is like a doll image of a little white girl, like a little blonde white girl with pigtails, and a big hole in her reproductive organs. And this is all about how women transitioning to be men is a terrible thing because it removes the ability of, ostensibly, as the author is writing about, fertile white young girls to continue to be baby incubators. And, I think about histories, misogynist histories about ways in which cis women are kept actually completely out of the framing dialogues about who's allowed to have contraception. And there are so many direct parallels, and that they're actually for the same exact reasons, I believe. They're not separate. They're the same reasons why transmasculine people have also been kept out of dialogues about the ways that these things impact our own health. We could ask all sorts of questions about why, but it's a feature and it's not a bug. And it's a part of these broader structures that you highlight so beautifully in your book about the ways that different kinds of misogyny and the ways that different structures around family and expectations about reproductive health are actually bleeding into the decisions that we're allowed to make on our lives for the sake of bodily autonomy. And Samira, I want to talk both about bodily autonomy and narrative autonomy. Who gets to write these stories? Who gets to talk about these histories and in what ways? So we've been asking different guests that we've had on the show recently, how would you define bodily autonomy? So given all of these different aspects that you're writing about in your book, how would you define bodily autonomy for our listeners?
I mean, I think I have a very basic definition of bodily autonomy, which is that I think that individuals have, by and large, the right to make choices based on the best information that they have available to them. They have the right to the information, and then they have the right to make the choices that are best for themselves and their own bodies. I think that there are some limits to this. Public health questions, things like vaccines. I'm coming to you from Colorado, where there have been a stunning number of cases of measles lately. And so I have questions about how much I would extend my sense of bodily autonomy to public health questions where herd immunity is an issue. But I think that what bodily autonomy is the right, when you are a person who can process the information and make those decisions, or a person who can express strong preference, right? That you have the ability to chart your own biological destiny.
You earlier spoke a little bit about the ways in which conversations about birth control intersect with eugenics.
Mhm.
And I think it's super important. I think you said it very quickly. It makes sense to me that you said it quickly. You're part of a scholarly world that explores abortion and reproductive justice and birth control, where that is kind of the water you're swimming in. I think for a lot of people, that's new. They may not know at all that conversations about eugenics are core to discourses about reproductive health, reproductive justice, especially as we look historically. One of the most powerful pieces of your book for me was how reproductive justice is a phrase that does not only refer to people who have the ability or the right to not have children. That's how it's typically most commonly understood. But there's so many layers of historic reasons why communities of color, why Black communities especially, look at this as a conversation of having the right to have children
Mhm.
in a world that actually wants, and this is where eugenics comes in, to have more of certain kinds of racialized people, typically white people, and fewer of black people. And this gets really, really, I don't have words for it other than like gross. Like, I think it's awful. And it's a necessary part of this conversation because I think it will lead into some of the ways in which there are Jewish layerings of this conversation as well. But I'd like to start actually with that racialized dimension. How does eugenics intersect with all of this, and why does it mean we need to understand reproductive justice differently for different groups of people?
So there are two terms in play: reproductive rights and reproductive justice. The reproductive rights movement is a movement that is primarily about the right to have access to birth control and abortion. It is a movement that has certainly had women of color in it, but was predominantly a movement spearheaded by white women. This is historically because of terms that are rooted in eugenics, and the terms are positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is not positive in the sense of good, it's positive in the sense of plus, right? So positive eugenics is trying to get the people who you want to have babies to have more babies. Panic about Jewish continuity and the trying to get Jewish people to have more babies, there is no other way to see it but as a positive eugenics project. Negative eugenics is when you have a group of people and you do not want them to have more children. There are forcible sterilization campaigns. The reproductive rights icon, Fannie Lou Hamer, was forcibly sterilized as a child. It is something that tends to happen to Black women. It is something that tends to happen to Indigenous women. Lots of stories about people going in to have a baby and waking up having had a C-section and a hysterectomy. It is something that also happened, although less frequently, to poor white women. For middle and upper class white women, there was pressure to have babies. So you wouldn't be able to, for instance, have your tubes tied. There's a formula, and it has to do with your age and the number of children that you've had. So if you're 28 and you've had 10 children, maybe yes. But if you're 28 and you've had 2 children, then no. Many other kinds of women, well, they wanted the right to not have children if they didn't want them, had to fight for the right to have children. And so in the mid 1990s, there was a reproductive rights convention where a group of Black women felt that their needs, the right to not be forcibly sterilized. So women of color were saying, we need the right to have babies. We need the right to have good prenatal care. We need the right to have good pediatric care. And so they wanted to bring those to the reproductive conversation. That movement is reproductive justice. And there is still pushback. I have given talks in synagogues about kind of timed to the Dobbs Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe versus Wade about reproductive rights and reproductive justice. And I have had women say to me, but abortion is the right that we're losing. Can't we concentrate on fighting and protecting for that? But of course, women of color have never had the right to, for instance, give their children water that didn't have lead in it. So I wanted to sort of make that distinction between reproductive rights and reproductive justice. Now, to the eugenics question. Before World War II, eugenics was really both a broader term than we think of it being now. It wasn't simply making sure white people had more babies and brown and Black people had fewer babies. It was also trying to make sure the babies were healthy. So lots of things that we today think of as really good: prenatal care, early childhood education, all sorts of things like that were also part of eugenics, and it was science. So all sorts of people who were sort of good intellectual people believed in eugenics. Planned Parenthood from the start wants all babies to be wanted and all babies to be healthy. And they believe that child spacing is central to that.
Meaning spacing in the number of years between them.
Right. Yeah. So birth control is absolutely braided into some of these conversations about eugenics. But at the time, birth control was sort of this edgy thing that feminists and radicals were interested in. And eugenics were where the respectable men of science were doing important scientific work. And so birth control activists like Margaret Sanger wanted to gain respectability by building alliances with eugenicists. And interestingly, the eugenicists often didn't want to build alliances with birth control activists because they didn't want to be tainted with feminism and things like that. It is totally fair that people from populations that are marginalized, that are targets of eugenic campaigns, have suspicions about the birth control movement. But I think the actual history is far more complicated, right? Both because we tend to forget that under the broader umbrella of eugenics were many things that today we think of as really good, and that those same communities fight for, like good prenatal care and adequate pediatric care. And so all of those things were originally part of this eugenics movement that birth control movements were trying very hard to build alliances with, because the eugenic movements were the respectable people, the birth control people were the like scrappy feminist activists.
So a frame that's come up earlier in this conversation briefly, and that's really critical to generations of Jewish discourse, is Jewish continuity. You bring it up in your book, I think, brilliantly, and you do so in a context of multiple religious forms of advocacy for birth control and opposition to birth control. What's the role that Jewish continuity plays in this story? How is it interacting with the specificity of the time period you're looking at, with the mid-20th through late 20th century? And of course, given that that contains the big elephant in the room of the Holocaust, I know that you write about how that plays a big role in this conversation. And so I'd love to hear more about Jewish continuity and the effect it has on birth control conversations.
So I think that there are two ways of thinking about it, in particular with the Holocaust. The first is, as I said, in the early part of the 20th century, eugenics is the scientific coin of the realm, as it were. The Holocaust changes that. The Holocaust shows what happens when race-based eugenics goes horribly wrong. But one of the things that you see, you get this Planned Parenthood founds during World War II, a National Clergymen's Advisory Committee. And first of all, they call it the Clergymen's Committee. Nobody has any sense of irony about it, and there are no women clergy involved, even though several liberal Protestant denominations are ordaining women already, and more will be shortly. And that conversation, from the get-go, they're very careful to do two things. They're very careful to avoid overt rhetoric about negative eugenics. They're very careful to oppose that language. There's a lot of talk by liberal Protestant clergy and a little bit less from Jewish clergy. A lot of talk by liberal Protestant clergy about the fact that birth control can never be imposed by the state. And there's an entire Protestant theology that is developed that talks about how basically birth control has turned procreation into a place for human moral agency, but it's only a moral action if it's freely chosen. This is a rhetoric that is actively being put forward to combat older eugenic conversations where it's compulsory. And that is a change that is brought on among liberal Protestants by the Holocaust and in their conversations with their liberal Jewish colleagues. The Jews are not being sort of the front men. And again, men is being used deliberately here. They're all men. And so the Protestant clergy are really leading on that. The more Jewish continuity piece is that birth control poses a problem for Jews who are worried about their declining numbers. There's a really compelling article that comes out in Lilith, the Jewish feminist magazine, in 1978. It's by a woman named Shirley Frank, in which Shirley Frank makes an argument. The continuity argument becomes really big in Judaism in the 1970s. And there's an article that calls Jewish women contraceptive virtuosos. That's a direct quote. And the implication is that they're even better at contraception than their non-Jewish counterparts, and that it's bad for the Jews. The president-elect of the New York Board of Rabbis Now I'm like, is it the Synagogue Council of America? I don't remember what he's leading. It's a man named Saul
The
Roth.
Judean People's Front or the People's Front of Judea? Yeah.
Exactly. A man named Saul Roth gets interviewed by the New York Times, and he never talks about birth control. He's talking about zero population growth. But he basically says 6 million people were eliminated in the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were eliminated in the Holocaust. If the Jewish population in the United States had been increasing at the rate that it was over the 30 years between World War II and the moment that he's talking in the early 70s, there would be 6 million more Jews alive today. Zero population growth is as bad for the Jews as the Holocaust, is what he's saying. And he's aware that this is the same period in which a book called The Population Bomb is very popular. So just like in the 1920s, everyone thought eugenics was the best that science, like was good science. In the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the idea that the population will grow so much that the world's population will outstrip its food production is sort of scientifically best, what the best that science has to offer on the subject. There are lots of problems with this because it's entirely a conversation about population growth and not about resource usage or equity in resource usage. But it is the coin of the realm. And Saul Roth says, I'm not saying that's not true. I am just saying that Jews are such a tiny, tiny percentage of the world population. Taking up ZPG, zero population growth, the Jews doing that is not going to help the problem. There are not enough of us. And therefore, we should be exempted from participating in the solving of this acknowledged global problem. Wow. Jews want to be seen and read as a modern scientific religion, and this is the scientific practice of the moment, but they want a kind of get out of jail free card for having to participate in the solution. Other people, this one is the Synagogue Council of America, has a conference on ZPG and the Jews. It becomes clear that they're not just worried about whether or not Jews are having 3 to 4 kids. They are worried that women are getting more education, and so they're starting later. So if at 20, you say, I want 3 to 4 kids, you are not going to probably have a problem doing that. I mean, you might, but it would be surprising. But if at 30, you say, I want to have 3 to 4 kids, you're going to hit declining fertility rates, and you might not pull it off, right? And you can see anxiety that women entering the workforce are making the space between generations bigger. So if you start sooner, every generation is bigger and they replicate faster. So they're worried about that. And it becomes really clear that what they're worried about is feminism. They are worried about Jewish women entering the workforce. They're worried that once they get into the workforce, they'll realize that their careers are rewarding. And also, the more kids you have, the harder the juggling is. And so they're saying they want 3 to 4 kids. They're worried that they'll change their mind and stop after 2. They are worried that because they will be in the workforce, because if you've invested in law school, you're less likely to stay home, that you won't stay home and run the sisterhood. They're not saying, how do we build robust and affordable daycare? They're not saying, let's get out there and advocate as religious leaders for the importance of supporting the family with universal childcare or healthcare. Nor are they saying we can do this internally. We can have the Jewish preschool and, we can turn Hebrew school into robust and fun after school care. They're not saying that. They're saying basically, how do we get Jewish women to have more babies? How do we get them to do it younger? And how do we get them to stay home so that instead of putting their energy into careers, they can put their energy into serious professional level volunteerism in Jewish communities?
I really want to comment on how beautifully you're weaving together so many different dialogues. You're doing so much comparative analysis about different kinds of religious discourses in the history of contraception. And I just wanted to ask you, especially to our lay leader audience of folks who may not themselves be historians, how do you see the role of history and the role of the historian in this dialogue? And how has that informed this incredible piece of work that you've made?
First of all, thank you for being so kind about the work. Most of the activism that I have participated in my life has been around reproductive health in some way or other. I really worry that both sides, the side that I am on and the other side tend to flatten the discourse to fit their historical needs. So the example that I'm thinking of is I was once at the early stages of research for this book, and I wasn't quite sure whether it was going to be about birth control or birth control and abortion. I was talking to a very young abortion activist who was saying women never regret their abortions. I was in my late 30s. I had friends who had had abortions, assuming that they would have children later and had never had the opportunity. They didn't regret their abortion if by regret, like if they could go back in time, like they also knew that it wasn't the right time in their lives, it wasn't the right person. But how they felt about it was certainly more complicated. I have done a lot of hotline or I've done some abortion doula work. People have a broad range of feelings about their abortions, ranging from profound joy and relief straight through to profound grief. Regret not that they had the tool of abortion, but that it was necessary in their lives, to feeling that this is a clump of cells and it's being removed and it's all of those things. And a discourse that doesn't allow space for all of those voices ultimately tells people whose experiences don't fit with the politically expedient discourse that their experience is somehow less valid. I also worry that if we say, oh, all early birth control activists were evil eugenicists, we both flatten the reality of their experience. Margaret Sanger absolutely was willing to get into bed, at least metaphorically, with leading eugenicists. But she cared hugely about women's rights to make the right choices for themselves. And that was a right that she extended to women of color. That if we lose sight of the deep way that history is complicated, that so many birth control advances were made for fundamentally conservative reasons, we can run the risk of running our contemporary movement off of a historical precedent that actually has some stuff that we might not support baked into it. I sometimes think that the backlash against contraception, like it's absolutely a backlash, right? When Eisenstadt versus Baird extends the right to contraception to single people, it immediately creates the question of whether that applies to teenagers without their parents' knowledge and consent. And it becomes a flashpoint about undermining birth control, which was supposed to, in the eyes of these religious and sometimes civic leaders, was supposed to support the family, the nuclear family. It's seen as an undercutting of parental authority. So it's a problem. Also, if you can have sex without being in a marriage, that undercuts the family. And so if you lose sight of the fact that birth control gained its respectability and its therefore broad use through this fundamentally conservative discourse, that backlash looks a lot more nonsensical than it does if you understand that for those people, it was a course correction. And I think knowing these things about our history can make us smarter as we decide how to chart our activist courses moving forward. I wrote this piece with Brett Crutch about why Judaism has been so bad at interfaith families and so good at marriage equality. It has to do, again, with these conservative impulses. Interfaith families erode the Jewish marriage, but as long as your same-sex partner is also a Jew, marriage equality supports the Jewish family, right? And so this lens can also see what we lost, a birth control movement that wasn't about women's sexual pleasure or women's economic autonomy, right? Can help us say, we want the birth control, but we want women's sexual pleasure and women's sexual autonomy and their economic autonomy. It can say, by the way, these tools are really useful for other groups of people who were never included in that heteropatriarchal family. But I think that in order to get to those places, we need to not shove a really complicated and sometimes messy, and Lex used the word gross to talk about eugenics earlier on, a sometimes gross history. We're ignoring the fact that good tools can come out of gross histories, or we're ignoring the fact that in the end it's a tool. You can build a house with a brick, or you can pitch it through the window of someone you don't like. But if you don't know the good and the gross in the history, it's really hard to not accidentally replicate the uses you don't want when you move forward with the tool.
A beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much, Samira Mehta, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Lex. It's always wonderful to talk to you. And Rina Yehuda, it's been lovely to get to meet you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As we close, a thank you in more than just words to you, but via discount code. You can get 30% off of the amazing book, God Bless the Pill, The Surprising History of Contraception and Sexuality in American Religion, by our guest today, Samira Mehta. The way you do that, just head to the uncpress.org website and head to the link for this book and type in the discount code at checkout 01social30. If that's hard to note down, just go to the show notes on our website and you'll be able to see it visually and copy paste. But if you go and purchase the book at uncpress.org, you can get 30% off with the code 01social30. So that's our first discussion point as we do this outro at the end of the episode. Purchase this incredible book. You don't want to miss it. And other things you don't want to miss include Shavuot Live, our 24-hour extravaganza of Jewish learning and unlearning, which is taking place May 22nd through 23rd. 24 hours straight of all the bestest Jewish learning you can find. I'm not even going to say this side of the Mississippi, partially because our listeners are on both sides of the Mississippi, but also because our listeners are all around the world and our attendees of this event are all around the world, bending time zones and the space-time continuum. I don't even know. Basically, head to Shavuot Live. The way to do so is to head to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot, that's SHAVUOT, and click the big button for sign up, and you'll get the Zoom info that you need in order to join on Shavuot. So that's coming up. Also, our certificate program in Unbound Judaism, applications have just opened. You can find out all that you need to in order to apply by heading to judaismunbound.com/certificate. As we close, we always want to encourage you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, there's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, you can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, to find show notes for this episode and all sorts of other juicy goodies. Third, there's our email addresses. And now we have one unified email address where you can contact both me, that's Lex, and Rina Yehuda Newman. And the way to do that is by sending a note to hosts@judaismunbound.com, HOSTS at judaismunbound.com. That will go to the two of us. Send your visions, your ideas for the Jewish future, your questions and comments on this episode, whatever you've got. Hosts@judaismunbound.com is the place to send us a note about it. A final piece is that you can stay in touch not only with us, the hosts of this podcast, but also with other listeners by joining our Discord. You can head to discord.judaismunbound.com, where there's incredible day-by-day, hour-by-hour even, conversations about Jewish history and Jewish contemporary reality and photos of your pets, all of that good stuff. Discord.judaismunbound.com is the place where you can connect to other Judaism Unbounders. So we'll leave it at that. Thanks again so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.